Hello and welcome, everybody, here for another Rising Tide Talk. I'm Matt, Roleplay Chat Capelli, and today we will be talking about accessibility in your tabletop RPG projects. I'm humbled to be joined today by an industry expert on accessibility. He is a tabletop RPG writer, accessibility consultant, and layout and document design expert, with credits in MCDM Studios, Underground Oracle Publishing, the DMs Guild, and many more. Please join me, and please do go wild in welcoming Chris Hopper to our interview today. Chris, welcome to Rising Tide Talks.
Thank you for having me, Matt. I'm excited to be here and humbled by that introduction. That was the lead and to live up to.
Well, hey, it's all stuff that I found. I did my research, and I'm impressed by the things that you have in your portfolio. So, Chris, I'm really excited to talk to you today about accessibility. I'm going to kind of divide it up into three parts. So, for those of you listening, the topics are going to be focusing on accessibility consulting first. And then we're going to talk a little bit about advice for making content accessible. And then we're going to end it off with a discussion about tools and resources that you might be able to use in your products. But if those three topics doesn't sound like it covers, the things that you need out of tonight's discussion, or if at some point a question pops into your mind, you're more than welcome. And in fact, you're encouraged to use the RT Discussion text chat here on the Rising Tide Discord server to share questions that are more specific. And then I'm going to try to keep, a 15 minutes at the end for us to go through those questions kind of one by one. So without further ado, Chris, you good to get going?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So then with that ready, let's head off to the races and let's talk first about accessibility consulting. If you don't mind, Chris, why don't I throw this over to you, and can you give us like an elevator pitch, for those of us who might be new to creating content, or even for those of us who might be new to hearing the term of having an accessibility consultant. What exactly is that?
Sure. And I should preface this with, this is a broad umbrella. This is a term, I'm giving you my definition of accessibility consulting. Definitely, as you're out there looking at how to make your documents more accessible, as you're out there looking at what accessibility means for your project, you may find different answers. But to me, accessibility is the practice of using design techniques to make your document more understandable, both visually and within assistive tech. And so what I mean about that is both composition and the technical structure. And I help with both.
Awesome. Yeah, that's fantastic. So that's very succinct. What kind of projects in general have you consulted on, or what kind of projects, in general would require an accessibility consultant in your view?
I think every project benefits, certainly, and I'll be glad to go into more depth on how you as a designer and as a writer can think with accessibility in mind and design with accessibility in mind. When it comes to any mass distributed PDF, anything you're putting on DriveThruRPG, anything you're putting on Itch, anything that you want to reach an audience broadly with, I think you do a disservice to your audience if you don't have at least some steps and some considerations. And I'm excited tonight to go into a lot of detail on what those are, because every project has budgetary time and other constraints. And so finding the balance between deliverable and doable is an important part of that. And that's a part that I'm really involved with whenever I'm on a project at any level, because on the big books, when working with publishers, I've gone into incredible depth. On the 20-page Itch project or the 4-page rule quick start guide, the same concepts apply. And so it's something that anytime you're writing for a broader audience, there's an application for it.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. And since you talked a little bit about the balance of cost and doable and what should be done, maybe this is a pointed question, but Chris, what's a going rate for an accessibility consultant? I know, as independent creators, sometimes the budget is tight. So what what's the going rate in general? What could people expect to pay to have their content be reviewed by an accessibility consultant?
And so again, I'm just going to speak from my personal pocketbook here. For when I'm involved with a project, the accessibility pass happens toward the end of production, and it's usually only a few hours depending on the book. A base level accessibility pass is going to be me taking your completed PDF, running it through some tests, spitting out some reports, and saying, here's what changes you can make, here's what changes I can make, here's what changes we can make.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's a consultation. So deciding on that sets the budget and the scope a little bit more. But generally speaking, it's the type of thing that lands in a couple hundred, not a couple thousand. It's the type of thing that lands. I've done accessibility consult for percent profits. Any layout that I do, I include the accessibility consulting,
Mm-hmm.
and it's only a few hours depending on the book. So if you imagine a layout or writer hourly rate, you're close within that. You're talking in the range of couple hundred bucks, not in the range of tons and tons of money. I've done consults as percent profit as part of TTRPG. I've done consults as flat rate and as a combination thereof. One of the things that I want to be sure that we touch on tonight is the steps that you can take as a creator so that you're starting with a baseline, more accessible product.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's something that we can reach out, and as you're creating things and as you're designing, you can design with accessibility in mind in ways that make that consult smoother or perhaps even unnecessary.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Maybe that's a good starting off point to talk about exactly some of those strategies or recommendations that you might have for folks to, from the get-go, make our content more accessible. And when I say content, I think for the most part, we're going to cover obviously written text, but I hope to also dive into other kinds of material, visual material, maps, icons, things like that. So I'll try to separate out my questions so that they're specific. But Chris, if you have advice that's all encompassing or covers very specific forms of content creation, don't hesitate to specify and dig deep, if you will, because that's what we're here for, is all of those juicy recommendations and advice. So yeah, let's start with the first question, and it'll be a little general, but I'd like to ask you, Chris, what kind of advice you can give to folks who are writing content. So this is, with regards to making their own text, or it's like a PDF document, an adventure, or what have you. What kind of advice can you give them to make their text more accessible? And if possible, are there examples of things that should be avoided also? And explain kind of the whys, if you don't mind.
Sure. The first thing that you want to keep in mind as you're creating let's just say your game, your document, your PDF, your game, is that you're designing a resource, not a novel. And what I mean by that is that your structure, your headings, your sections, your pieces are going to get chunked up and accessed in ways that you may not expect based on your own understanding of writing it.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to take a document, look at a document, and recognize it as a conglomerate of parts that you have assembled in this manner, and take a step back and look at where you can streamline, where it makes the most sense. Parallelism is very important, making sure that as you break up your sections and as you designate these hierarchies of information, that you're doing so in a way that lines up similarly across levels. So for example, let's say your chapters are introduction, rules, and lore. Pretty clear, solid designations. This is a short document, obviously, but pretty clear designations within there. Now, within introduction, you might have things like why I wrote this book, where this book's taking you, what this book's going to do. In rules, you might have how to roll the dice. You might have which dice to roll. You might then have why the skill level of certain monsters is adjusted from those of others. One of those things is not like the others.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding that the piece that you're building is going to be navigated by those headings, and thinking of it more like a web page or like a living document or like an outline will help you structure your content in such a way that a reader using assistive tech moves through it more easily. And also, a reader not using assistive tech can move through it more easily.
Yeah, and I really like your point about how, this material is definitely going to get diced and sliced and moved around. I know that's, how I use most material that I purchase and run for my games. So it's safe to assume that the general audience is not going to be reading it from A to Z. Or maybe they are once, but then when it comes time to actually implement and use the tool, it does get sliced and diced in the way that's best for that user. So I could really appreciate that recommendation of having these different headings that are very clear. Is it best for this kind of thing to be consistent, or that the each categorization, each heading, the content therein follows a similar structure, or is there flexibility there? And how do you feel about that?
You need to be pretty rigid within your chapters.
Mm-hmm.
You can have a little flexibility between chapters, but within your chapters, you want to be sure that you are chunking in a reasonable manner, just because, not just for the assistive tech end of things, but just because as your readers navigating it, that's going to help keep track of how these components are interacting with each other and how they move through. So I'm kind of bird walking there. Let me give you a more concrete example. When you're using a screen reader, NVDA is one of the most common visual assistive screen readers. When you're using a screen reader, you'll use a keyboard shortcut or a device shortcut to jump down the header levels.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a lot of people's default reading mode. And so even if they are experiencing this document for pleasure, that is, going cover to cover as if it were a novel, they're going to click through those headers to determine which section is happening and which thing is next. The assistive tech actually navigates by header, like how you navigate through iconography on your computer.
Mm-hmm.
And so having those clearly labeled headers is probably one of the single most important first steps. And having an understandable navigable hierarchy where your headings are really defining what's going on is something that's a place where you want to be clear.
Yeah.
You can still have voice, you still have humor, but that's a place where you want to be clear at the same time.
That's really solid advice with regards to the headers and kind of having that structure. As far as, the written text itself, are there things that should be, things that we should consider when it comes to the layout or like the use of things like italics or colors or things like that? Not in any kind of graphics, but just, in a standard paragraph describing rules or describing, the lore behind a location or what have you.
So there's 2 or 3 things to look for here, depending again on your audience and how in depth you're going.
Hello, Editor Ty here. My apologies for the interruption. However, unfortunately, Chris's audio cut out at this point. But he talks about creating content for kids, as is becoming increasingly popular. And, when doing so, to definitely watch out for the Lexile. Lexile is a way of measuring reading level, and there are tools online where you can plug in your text and it'll spit out a Lexile level, where certain numbers will equal a certain grade's reading level. Okay, back to the interview.
At a more base level, contrast is always important.
Mm-hmm.
Getting into the actual visual of it, typically sans serif fonts are going to be more readable than serif. And so this kind of gets into the experience of using these books. We all have fond memories of whatever that first game book was that we picked up and flipped through and went, wow. And like for me, it was 3rd edition. And 3rd edition had a larger typeface than 2nd edition, than 5th edition, actually. But it used these really aggressive backgrounds and sometimes did like fake line art and things behind them that doesn't always translate to somebody with either dyslexia or dyscalculia or with somebody who's visually impaired. And so on a design level, if you want to create a evocative design that's leaning into a stylized motif, then consider creating a high contrast version of your document. This is what I do with MCDM's Arcadia. Every month, MCDM's Arcadia comes out with a gorgeous full color version and a nearly plain text grayscale version, so that the grayscale version can be read and used in more accessibility options, and also because it's a little more printer friendly. And so either simplifying your typeface, using high contrast in your base design, or providing a high contrast version. And then if you're worried about the content itself, there are Lexile tools to evaluate the actual complexity of it. Or again, your editors. Editors are wonderful and will definitely tell you when you're getting a little excessive. Get a good editor. You can find some editors with experience toward either classroom writing or grade writing, or that's something I've worked with editors before where it's been a case of, okay, this is a grammar thing. How is this on the accessibility thing, and navigating that?
I think that's all fantastic advice, Chris. Yeah, that's all really, really solid advice. You talked a little bit about background images and how that can kind of make it more complicated to read the text. I wonder if, maybe we can talk about images too. I know that in the audience and in the Discord community, we have a lot of folks who they're artists, they're map makers and that sort of thing. When creators are considering incorporating these kind of images or visual aids like charts or tables or diagrams into their content, what kind of accessibility considerations should they be thinking about? What are the pros and cons of using these kinds of mediums in our content from an accessibility perspective?
Right. I certainly, I can't tell anyone to make a tabletop RPG book without images, right? Like that's not the goal here. And so making alt text for your images that is descriptive, evocative, and comprehensible is again a big part of what I do and a big part of what you as a writer or creator can do. I've had artists provide their own alt text. I've worked with artists to kind of massage and edit alt text to make sure that it was reflecting just today, those were scimitars, not rapiers, conversations like that. But it is important that the alt text that you develop for your illustrative images conveys as much of the artist's vision as possible, as succinctly as possible. So it's a creative writing exercise. You can use a few sentences. You've got room because, again, anyone who's using a screen reader and is visually impaired, the idea is to deliver the fullest experience possible regardless of medium. So that means capturing the artist's vision in words.
Does the same caveat about the alt text apply to the use of like diagrams or tables or things like that also?
So yes, and sort of. So in the case of a diagram, like let's say you have a Venn diagram where I don't have a polite Venn diagram in mind.
Yeah, I'm just thinking a lot of rules and things tend to try to illustrate their mechanics, whether that be like a combat mechanic or some kind of conflict resolution mechanic via some form of, condensed, simplified visual representation of that mechanic.
Yeah, I'm working on an example that's NDA'd right now, and so I'm trying to steer away into another one. It isn't. And so, like, let's say, for example, you have you have a diagram of filling out a character sheet, and on that character sheet, you mark skills. This is something we've done in 5e. You mark your skills, and the illustration shows, or Vampire is actually an even better example. On Vampire the Masquerade, you have dots that you fill in. The illustration shows those dots filled in. The descriptive text might read something like a section of the Vampire character sheet showing where, I don't remember the name of Vampire skills anymore. It was showing where Suck Blood has 3 out of 5 dots filled with black pencil. It's concisely summative of what the image is showing in such a way that, again, somebody not looking at the image can understand what's being conveyed. And so that's on a diagram level. That can get chunky sometimes. That can get to be something that you work with a little bit. And that's as far as your creator, That's why you probably want to avoid 12-page tables or 18 steps in character creation. Like, there's some cases to be made for brevity there.
Yeah.
But on a more basic level, the design pieces, as a game designer, as somebody who's gonna, let's imagine you're creating a board game, not a tabletop game, but same rules apply. You're gonna sit down and teach somebody how to do this. If you can't adequately describe it in words, neither can the alt tech. And so that's why typically there's an accessibility consultation phase to this, because there is some conversation of ways that you can optimize. And identifying that's a skill that we as game designers hone anyway, and something that I think that we all work toward. But it is something that sometimes becomes part of the accessibility conversation because it brings it out more apparently when you start to experience this content through a different medium.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why accessibility consultants exist, I'm sure, because especially in the space of tabletop role-playing games, it's hard to imagine summarizing content without having a random table or having some kind of visual representation of it. So yeah, I think there's definitely, for me personally, a muscle that I need to flex there. We got a few questions in the chat here that are relevant to this. So Chris, I'm gonna bring them up. And I'll also take this opportunity to remind folks listening, if possible, to please use the RT discussion text chat. There's two in the chat here. One from Jenga D. She asks, would all tabletop RPG resources being released in kind of a art version and text only version, would that be like a perfect scenario? Would that solve most accessibility concerns in your view, Chris?
I don't think it's necessary in all cases. For example, Tal'Dorei Reborn doesn't have a high contrast accessibility version because we were able to get all of the screen reader friendly content into their regular document, and their document design has high enough contrast and readable enough font and solid enough design that we deemed it not necessary. I say we, that's probably a they. It is very much a case-by-case evaluation. It certainly never hurts. And what Wizards is doing with D&D Beyond is a fascinating alternative to that, because D&D Beyond is HTML. And a lot of D&D Beyond is, by virtue of being loaded into a website, significantly more accessible than the same book that you might go out and purchase. But the website itself has some accessibility issues which haven't been addressed. And then also there's a significant cost barrier.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all solution, but it is certainly a solid go-to a lot of the time.
Yeah, that's really solid advice, Chris. Another question sort of similar to this one, and feel free to say that you've answered it already, if you feel like you have. But Bryce asks that, or she explains that she tries to release most of her content with a separate image and text layers in the PDF itself. I'm not too familiar with this, so you might need to explain to me what that means, and maybe to others who don't know. But also, Bryce is effectively saying, like, is that a good solution? Is that a reasonable thing for her to do so that you can turn off the images in the PDF?
Yes, having your images on a separate layer is a solid way to make a print-friendly, high contrast, to simplify the design. If your images can be turned off and everything still makes sense, absolutely. That is cool. I know, I can't remember the name of it. It's something. There's it was Kickstarted a couple of years ago. There's a tabletop guy out there that does what I would call like layered accessibility. Within your standard PDF, you get your PDF of the tabletop game. It has the full version on one layer. It has a sans serif font with high contrast and not much else going on the page on another layer. It has images and alt text on a layer, and then it has kind of like a combined mode where you can a la carte whatever your particular things are.
That's
So
neat.
yeah, definitely with your software, which we can talk software in a minute, 'cause some of these things are limited by what you're working with. But if your software allows it, then working with layers is a handy way to provide options to your users. And as I'm sure Bryce knows, you can put those controls into interactive PDF menus. And so you can put within the PDF on the cover page or on a sidebar that moves through the whole document the method of swapping between those layers to easily and readily adjust the content appropriately.
Awesome. There you go. I hope that answers your questions, Jenga and Bryce. I know it was very insightful for me. So thanks, Chris, for explaining that out. I think that makes a whole lot of sense. We talked a little bit about layout and having your headers and things. I did want to maybe shift and focus a little bit more on layout.
Right.
As far as like content structure, as far as titles and having your content laid out in a specific way, whether that be in small columns, like several columns on a page, or in big blocks of text. What are other things, if any, that you feel like are things that should be considered when it comes to kind of organizing the finished product as we lay it out on a page? And even, as far as having like physical products, small booklets versus large documents, things like this, like what kind of recommendations for kind of layout would you have for folks listening?
Okay. So there's a few different pieces to that. Firstly, as an accessibility consultant, I can pretty much unilaterally say the most acceptable design is not going to be the one that sells a book on a shelf at your friendly local board game store. It's all about finding the compromises and the planning that delivers what everybody needs and without outweighing one particular over another.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would be really surprised to see Wizards of the Coast put out a book in the form of Blades, the Blades in the Dark books.
Mm-hmm.
The Blades in the Dark books are a masterclass in physical accessibility. They are single column, concise, use high contrast and blocking of their elements to really chunk up the parts that you need. And that's one of the things that I think is reflected in the fandom around that particular community because it feels so easy to pick up and to play. It's not just that it feels easy to pick up and play because it's well written. It is. As Droth and Harper did amazing with it. But it also feels easy to pick up and play because it's navigable and it's a nice, handy little book. So if you can create smaller, tighter, concise games, by all means do so. You always want to pack that punch as tightly as you're able with anything you're creating. And that's just good writing advice. Within the 5e ecosystem, and I'm going to say the 5e ecosystem because against my better judgment, I'm going to lump in 5e, Pathfinder, Cypher. What else? Other mainline systems across multi-book publications. You're often already working in a style guide that your readers are familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody knows what the little italic text under the name on the stat block means and why that little 6-row table has those 3-letter abbreviations above it. Or in Cypher, everybody knows there's going to be a third column with running annotation, things like that. From an accessibility standpoint, not always the best. But from a audience standpoint, part of a greater conversation that they started without you. And so you have to balance anything that you're designing, you have to balance against what your audience brings into it. And so if you're making a 5e book and you don't use italicized subheadings to describe that your wondrous item is of legendary quality, you're gonna have to be prepared to defend why. You're going to have to make it clear to your user that this is different because of this, because otherwise it's just different. So that conversation, that we're talking about accessibility here, but it does kind of fold into a broader conversation of design. That conversation of I've built something using somebody else's toys. I've built something out of these Legos that I was provided that go down to one piece, but not a half piece, factors in to anything that you're building, to your building and publishing. All of that said, you're making your own game, you're making your own pamphlet, you're making your own thing.
Yeah, that's fair, man. We have another question in the chat, and folks listening, I know I said we'd get to the questions at the end, but I feel like they're relevant to specific parts of our conversation. So I'm going to bring another one up now, and then if I don't get to the questions in the discussion channel right away, I'll make sure we get to them at the end. But Old Gus has a question, and it's again kind of related to kind of the accessibility of the flow and things like that. So their question starts with a statement. It can be hard for anyone who wants something to be attractive, but also to be able to iterate versions of a living document while providing proper accessibility aftercare. What are the document workflows you've worked with that allowed for quick iterations of accessible documents where header structures and table contents are fully accessible?
Oh, Gus. Okay. After my own heart, man. Okay. This is an ongoing challenge. That is something that has several answers, none of which are great.
Okay. Yeah.
So I work largely in Adobe products. I've been in Adobe for my entire creative career. Adobe, I pay my Adobe tax. Within Adobe, you can use an XML source, and you can link documents that exist in XML. This is getting gnarlier than I would wish on a typical tabletop project. This is, in fact, not something I think I've done in tabletop, other than I did it on one of my own projects. But you can, if it's something that is still being iterated on, you can link to an XML document, or you can link to an external source. Adobe also has a new tool called Live Something. I should remember that, but I don't use it. Adobe now has a tool that works like Bridge for text. I can't remember what it's called, but you can have a live linked Word document, probably a Google document even, that the styles are matched. And so because the styles in Acrobat are matched, as long as you're using the predefined styles in your document, your writers can go crazy on the document, and those changes will in real time update in InDesign. That being said, earlier on I mentioned that accessibility pass usually happens at the end. That's a lot of why. So for my overall flow, and I can talk about this one, for my overall flow right now, with MCDM, I've got some projects where I've got a giant folder of images and I've got a giant spreadsheet, and I'm going through all these images and I'm writing alt text for all these images, and I'm happy as a clam because this book looks amazing. And I'm building all of that in advance so that when the writers get done with the book, or in this case, when the editors get done with the book, I just have to insert the alt text and then run it through the standard checks. But when it comes to a living document, and I mean, when it comes to errata and things like that too, that is a challenge.
Yeah. Sounds like it's an ongoing quest for folks to figure out.
Yep.
Maybe it looks like Jenga also has thoughts. So maybe the three of you can hammer it out and solve the problem for all of us. But I appreciate your honesty, Chris. And it's one of those things that maybe there isn't a perfect solution out there yet. But it takes the community to hopefully get close to one. I'm looking at the clock, and I want to make sure we have time to talk about tools. And also, I have one other question about, advice for accessibility. So let's maybe get through this one quickly, Chris, and then we could go on to talking about tools and, some questions from the audience. So really quickly, as far as, content creators who perhaps aren't writing content or drawing content, but for people who are in a kind of the audio visual space, so streamers, podcasters, the folks in that realm, is there any kind of big pieces of advice or recommendations you can give to those folks as far as making their content more accessible?
So I know that there's automatic subtitling now built into at least some levels of some tiers of Twitch and YouTube as well.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, having subtitles, however you get them, having subtitles is important. Even if you're adding them in post, if you're a Twitch streamer, leave that space for your subtitles, get them up on stream. I will say, if you have the budget for it, don't rely on necessarily the thing baked in. I know that there are better softwares available. I do not know what those are. The accessibility consulting has been pretty much limited to document design. But I know that they're out there.
Hey, it's Editor Ty again, popping in because Chris wanted to shout out Jennifer Kretschmer at this point, who has been a wonderful advocate for accessibility in the community and put together an amazing compilation of resources for free. It's simply called Accessibility in Gaming Resource Guide, and Jennifer Kretschmer is spelled JenniferKretschmer. You can also find them as Dreamwisp, DreamWisp, on socials. All right, back to the interview.
Yeah, awesome. That sounds like a solid starting point, Chris. Does the same kind of apply for promotional material like posters or things like that folks might be, blasting out on socials? Basically everything you said up until this point, I would imagine also applies in that context.
Yep. Use your alt text. Use contrast. Check to make sure that what you're creating has good contrast and has alt text, and ideally both.
Awesome. Cool. All right. So with that, let's move on to talking about tools. So thanks, Chris, for giving us all those wonderful recommendations. If we're trying to put it into practice, we need some tools and resources to help us do it. What would be kind of some of the things in your pocketbook, in your toolbox, as you were, to make our tabletop writing more accessible?
So the good news is, and I'm talking about screen reader a lot because that's the major hurdle with PDFs. The good news is, if you want to try out your PDFs that you own now in a screen reader, NVDA is free. You can just install it on your computer, set it up, and roll. There's a handful of other ones out there. If you Google free screen reader, you'll find software. NVDA is by and large the most broadly distributed, but there are plenty of other ones out there. As far as creating it, I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, Adobe owns the PDF spec. It is Adobe's PDF system.
Mm-hmm.
If you're wanting to make your PDFs accessible, the primary way to doing that is to at least have Adobe Acrobat Pro. You can do it with just Acrobat Pro, which beats paying for the entire Creative Suite, but it is a whole lot easier with Creative Suite, particularly with InDesign, which has tools built into it to make sure that it exports correctly.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're checking your existing stuff, NVDA will get you visual stuff. Reading up on just design thinking, if you I'm blanking on some of the books now. Reading up on just kind of general visual design may give you some ideas to chase down, as far as like, how do I make sure that this font is good at scale or in my ad or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to making things, if you don't have Adobe, you can create accessible versions of your documents in HTML or in EPUB or even Word now. Word has an accessibility tool built into it, and it'll spit out docx's that get read properly.
Awesome.
So if you don't have Adobe, consider just offering that high contrast version that I was talking about with some basic formatting in Word. That can get you something that, depending on what you've made, may fill the same need. And again, I keep circling back around to depending on what you've made, because that's a great answer for a certain kind of game.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's where you really want to dig into what goals you're aiming to accomplish and what specifically you're wanting to accommodate.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a really fantastic collection of tools there that you mentioned, Chris. As far as, templates or perhaps, catalogs of best practices, obviously this episode is a fantastic springboard for folks who are dipping their toes into making their content accessible. But are there websites or places where people can, that you could recommend going to that might have, like I said, these catalogs of best practices or links to templates and things like that? Does that exist?
I learned through W3C accessibility for government document design and for web pages. I'm a web designer by day, and so I learned through W3C compliance. If you Google W3C accessibility, you'll get a ton of really thick legal documents. It's kind of like reading the IEEE spec. It's dense. The good news is that it's also required by the government, which means there's lots and lots and lots and lots of books on how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Core concepts there carry right over. It's about getting your text into a understandable XML format. I think, trying to remember some of my design influences, I think the book that I'm thinking of is called Design for Humans. Some basic graphic design textbooks. A lot of accessible design is, at the end of the day, graphic design. If you're brushing up on contrast and white space and page layout, page use, then you're brushing up on accessibility sideways anyway.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The goal of any good design is clear communication. That folds right into design thinking for accessibility.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know I can speak to that legal jargon, those documents that you mentioned. When I was looking up the kind of questions to ask you tonight, I found a similar, I'm Canadian, so I found a similar, series of best practices on a Canadian accessibility website funded by the government of Canada. And yeah, it was a little hard to parse through, but at the end of the day, there were still some useful links there. Links to some of the things you mentioned too earlier, like the lexicon score, the contrast scores, tools that are free to use for people to kind of plug their content into and then be given a score. I think those are handy and practical tools to have on hand also. Awesome. I have another question for you, Chris, and then there's a couple of outstanding questions in the discussion text chat. So we might go 5 minutes over. I hope is that a problem for anybody?
I have all night.
Well, we won't go all night, but we will hope maybe go 5 minutes over 7:30. Yeah. So another quick question about tools, Chris, and it's more about finding an accessibility consultant.
Okay.
So where should tabletop RPG content creators go if they're looking for accessibility consulting? How do they know what kind of accessibility consultant should be considered and when?
That is a good question. Somebody has an index. DOTS. The DOTS RPG project, dotsrpg.org, they make Braille dice.
Cool.
They have a brief list of accessibility and disability consultants specific to audience. So everybody on there got a little paragraph. You got specifically what they might work toward or specialize in. And more broadly, if you Google, I don't know all of these.
Oh yeah, Jenga posted it in the chat there. The Dots RPG.
Sweet. Awesome.
Cool.
Yeah. So as far as an index, that's a good starting point. I'll be honest, I haven't had much content in the field yet. I would, if you meet more, let me know, because I am taking this trail one book at a time. I know Devon Rue does some, and that's DEVENRUE on Twitter. So shout out to her.
Awesome. I think that gives us a good starting point. So thank you, Chris, and thank you, Jenga, for posting that link in the RT discussion text chat. So I think that covers the questions that I had planned. I'm going to go to the text chat to see if there's anything else that we haven't addressed yet. There's one here from Trevor Sala. Trevor says, including links in a credits section to a web page seems obvious. Also, within the document from a table of contents to the appropriate pages.
Mhm.
Are links to areas within the document generally helpful or harmful to accessibility? For instance, linking monster names to their stat blocks or character names to a dramatis personae page.
Great question. Generally, they are more helpful than harmful.
Okay.
So let me clarify that. For somebody who is visually challenged but not blind, that's somebody who might be reading with a zoom or with plain text or experiencing the document still on a screen, then the links are great because they'll get you where you need quickly without a lot of scrolling and flailing. And typically, depending on how your cross link is formed, you can get back and forth with them more easily.
Mm-hmm.
For somebody who is using a Braille reader, there's Braille things that spit back out, or for things that are pure audio, a lot of links can be disruptive because the assistive software has to announce that that's a link. And so if you're reading along, then it's going to say, found in the deep chasms of link to section on blah, blah. And that in rapid succession could be disruptive. In my experience, having the link outweighs the disruption of the text to speech calling it out.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, users who are relying on assistive text are used to intertextual links announcing themselves and getting them where they need to be. That said, testing is always your best friend. If you can throw it in a handful of people who use this regularly, that's going to be better than my off-the-cuff answer. But generally speaking, what I've found is that the intertextual links have been preferred.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely good caveats there for us to consider. There's one other question in chat, and it's from Christoph. So Christoph, you talk about resources for creating accessibility documents. I think we covered it. Maybe let me know if we didn't. I'm gonna keep going on with kind of the conclusions and stuff, but let us know in the chat if we didn't cover tools specifically. So yeah, I think, Chris, this gives us a lot to think about. So thank you for the fantastic conversation about making our content more accessible. Before we say our goodbyes and kind of do the outro and all that, did you have any last thoughts or considerations for us here tonight on accessibility? Something that maybe was burning a hole in your head that you haven't been able to say because I didn't ask the right questions.
I think my number one thing to take away, because this is a lot to squeeze into an hour, right? Making the effort and doing the research will reward all of your readers.
Mm-hmm.
And generally speaking, understanding your creation in a new way benefits everyone.
Yeah, I think that's super succinct and very true, because making content easier to read, making content easier to understand only will end up benefiting everybody. So you're 100% right in that regard. So thanks again, Chris, for having this wonderful chat with us tonight. I highly recommend to everybody who's here, either live or listening in podcast land, to take a look at Chris's material and give him a follow on your social media platform of choice. Chris, can you remind us where we can do that?
Absolutely. You can find me on Twitter right now still at ChrisHopper2, and you can reach out with business inquiries or to see some samples at linktre.ee/ChrisHopper.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. So yeah, everybody go check Chris out, give him a follow. And while you're at it, please also come and follow the Tabletop RPG Rising Tide on the socials that you choose to use. So that's at TTRPG Rising Tide on Twitter and Mastodon. We'd also appreciate it if you could spread the good word of our amazing Discord community and these amazing discussions, for creatives by creatives, to your friends and other folks that you think might, stand to benefit from these fantastic discussions. I'm Matt. I'm Roleplay Chat on all socials, and this has been another Rising Tide Talk. Join us live in our Discord community for our next event taking place next week. It's next Tuesday, May 2nd at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, where I'm going to be talking with the prolific Hit Point Press folks about their upcoming Shift tabletop RPG system and kind of just, share strategies and advice to writers and creators looking to kind of build their own system from the ground up. So with that, let's say goodbye. Bye, everyone, and see you at the next Rising Tide Talk.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Bye, everybody.